All right, advanced biology students, on to our next segment. We're going to be talking about interactions in ecosystems. How do organisms interact with each other? Because there's a variety of ways that they do this. So, first of all, we need to define a couple of terms. We've talked a lot about ecosystems versus habitats. We know that there are multiple habitats within an ecosystem. Now we're going to be adding the term niche to our list of vocab terms. Habitat and niche also have similarities, just like habitat and ecosystem did, but habitat and niche are also different from each other. A habitat are all of the biotic and abiotic factors in the area where an organism lives, where the species lives out its life. Again, habitat, this definition sounds very similar to ecosystem. The major distinction is this is more specific, a narrow view of that. You can have multiple habitats within one ecosystem. Now, a niche is composed of all the physical, chemical, and biological factors that a species needs to survive, stay healthy, and reproduce. So, how it lives within the habitat. Habitat is where, niche is how. So a way of distinguishing between the two, an earthworm, for example, its habitat might be in the soil. Its niche is that it's a decomposer. So habitat is where an organism lives, and niche is like its job. Like, what is its role within that ecosystem or habitat? All right, so the things that make up an organism's niche. A, food. So what kind of food does the species eat? How does it compete for that food? Where does it fit into the food web? Meaning, is it a primary consumer? Is it a top scavenger? Or sorry, is it a scavenger? Is it a top level carnivore? Things like that. These are parts of its niche. The abiotic conditions it requires. So does it require moist soil, or does it like to be exposed to the air, or does it like a lot of sunlight? Does it like a higher temperature range? These are things that contribute to the niche as well. For example, certain types of trees you might find in a rainforest prefer warmer and damper environment than, let's say, pine trees, for example. These are parts that make up this tree's niche. And then behavior. This also contributes to an organism's niche. So what time of day is the species active? Where and when does it reproduce? Is it a migratory bird? Things like that. Resource availability is really one of the key features that gives structure to a community. Biology is the fight for survival, the fight to survive, and the fight to reproduce and pass on your genes. Okay, although the organisms don't do this knowingly, they are constantly competing to survive. And so resource availability is a huge aspect of that. So by resources, we mean things like habitat space, we mean mates, we mean food. These are things that are resources that are available to organisms. Competitive exclusion is something that can happen when you have limited resources. So when two species are competing for the same resource, one species ultimately will be better suited to that niche than the other. And so the other species will be pushed into another niche or become extinct. So for example, you have two species up here that are competing for habitat space. And this is at the ocean. So here's our high tide line and our low tide line. And this top species is most likely better at competing for the open space, or it's more adapted to living in open air more of the time. These organisms down here below probably prefer a little bit damper environment, so they've competed for these two portions of habitat. And if both of these organisms were not, like let's say for example, this species was pushed up top but doesn't do well in open air, most likely the species will go extinct in the area. Competitive exclusion can result in some other outcomes. So for example, niche partitioning. And this is the dividing up of a niche by two or more competing species. So for example, you see a couple different species of birds in the diagram below. These are birds that are dividing up their niche. They're dividing up the tree. They're tree-dwelling birds. And they're dividing up parts of the tree. So some species might prefer and move towards the top of the tree or the bottom. And in this way, populations can coexist. You can also see an evolutionary response in where divergent evolution results in the selection of different successful traits. So when only certain areas of a niche are available, you might see selection for certain beak types. So in our same example from our tree in the previous picture, maybe the birds that have been pushed to the bottom of the tree are going to be more adept at getting insects that are in the soil and at the base of the trunk of the tree, whereas ones up top might look for more flying insects, for example, and so they're going to have different beak structures as a result of that. And different birds within their species that have these specialized beaks are going to fare better, and thus you'll see divergent evolution as a result. You can also see an evolutionary response as a result of of niche partitioning. So you can see organisms that when they are moved to different parts of the niche, they may have to, it might select for certain characteristics. So in our birds that we're looking on the last slide, different parts of the tree have different food items, which might select for specific beak types that are better at getting these prey versus others. And so you can see a wide range of beaks that are produced as a result of something like this. You can also see ecological equivalence as a result. And these are species that occupy similar niches but live in different geographical regions. This is also extra evidence for evolution because we see similar organisms in completely different parts of the world. The example I have here below are a type of tree frog. You see a tree frog in Madagascar with bright coloring. It lives on broad-leaved plants, likes a lot of moisture that you find in Madagascar. And you see a very similar tree frog, yes, a different color, but still brightly colored, still preferring the same type of habitat space in the Amazon rainforest, completely different continent. Other ways that organisms can interact are things like competition and predation. These are two important ways in which they do so. So competition occurs when two organisms fight for the same limited resources. If I brought in one pizza for a class of 36 students, you guys are going to compete a lot for that limited resource. If resources aren't limited, meaning I bring in 10 pizzas for one class, you're not going to see competition. There's not going to be that pressure to compete in that situation. Resources, again, to review are things like food, habitat space, and mates. So this is the kinds of things you see organisms competing for. You can see interspecific competition. This is competition between different species, like different species of birds in the tree, different species of intertidal organisms like we see here. You can also see intraspecific competition, and this is competition between organisms of the same species. Here we see zebras competing. This is most likely between two males competing for a mate of some kind, so this might be part of their reproductive strategy. Predation is the process by which one organism captures and feeds upon another one. So the predator and the prey. So you have this predator-prey relationship. Other ways that organisms can interact in an ecosystem is through symbiosis. Sym means together, and biosis is life or living. So symbiosis literally translates to living together. But this is a very, very close type of living together. And this is a close relationship, a close ecological relationship between two or more organisms of different species. So first of all, they're closely living together, but they're not the same species, and they are in direct contact with one another. So for example, predator-prey, although they might live in the same area, that's not really symbiosis because they're not in direct contact with each other all of the time. So there's three ways that organisms can live together. They can have a symbiotic relationship. So three types of symbiotic relationships. You have mutualism, which is where both species benefit from one another. Here you see an eel and a cleaner shrimp. Cleaner shrimp gets food, eel gets rid of parasites and things like that. So this is an example of mutualism. Commensalism is where one receives an ecological benefit from the other, but the other one doesn't really care. They're neither harmed nor helped. And a good example of this, humans, in our eyelash follicles, we actually have dust mites called dermatocids, or not dust mites, they're eyelash mites called dermatocids that eat our oil secretions and dead skin cells and things like that in our eyelash follicles. We don't notice that they're there, and they get habitat space, essentially. In any one eyelash follicle, which you can see right here, you can have up to 20 of these mites living around it. And these guys each measure about 0.4 millimeters in length. So you can't really see them unless you're using a microscope. And this is a close-up of what they look like. So you can see them around the follicle, and this is what they look like individually. And the last form is called parasitism, and this is similar to predation in that one organism benefits while the other is harmed. But again, this is close living together. So parasites are in direct contact with their host. Okay? Whereas predator-prey, this is a little different. They're not living in direct contact all the time. An example of this is our hornworm caterpillar and the Berkhanid wasp. So the wasp will lay its larva on this caterpillar, and the larva will feed directly off the caterpillar as they develop. They don't release until they reach the pupae stage, which is unfortunate for the hornworm caterpillar because it will eventually die as its organs are being consumed by the larva over time. Other examples of parasites, we think of things like ticks and mosquitoes. They derive benefit from their host because they consume blood from their host, but often they carry pathogens such as things like malaria and mosquitoes, and then Lyme disease and ticks. So that can actually harm their host as a result. All right, now how do organisms arrange themselves within their habitat? Well, sometimes we have to look at population density to look at what's happening within an ecosystem. Here's a map of population density of the United States, one measuring human numbers. Okay, so the darker the color, the more densely populated the area, and the population density is the number of individuals that live in a defined area. And it's the measurement of the number of individuals living in a defined space that we can calculate using number of individuals over area in units squared. Now, depending on the organism, the area measurement might be different. So for humans, we might use square miles. For something like birds, it might be square meter or square kilometers. For something like insects in a certain plot of ground soil, we might look at square meters. So the unit of area depends on what organism it is you're looking at. Now, in addition to density, that just tells us an average number of that space. But sometimes we also like to look at how do organisms organize themselves, like how do they interact with each other. So in this case, geographic dispersion, the definition of that is of population. It shows how individuals in a population are spaced out from each other. There are 3 diagrams. I would highly encourage you pausing the video clip at this time and drawing these 3 diagrams over here. Population dispersion is the way in which individuals of a population are spread in an area or a volume. Okay, so it could be square area, or if you're looking at, let's say, a fluid environment or water-based, you might look at square volume. Like plankton, you might use volume as a measurement of this. There's 3 different patterns. There's clumped, uniform, or randomly dispersed. And you can see them looking what they look like over here. So this is clumped, uniform, and then random dispersion. And examples of what that is. A school of fish is clumped dispersion. They clump together. Same thing with like a pack of wolves. That's an example of clumped. Uniform might be certain types of nesting birds. They equally space out from each other. Additionally, certain trees are uniform in that they'll, grow in rows. Those are examples of uniform. Random are things like, for example, the sloth. There's no real pattern to where we find them. They don't live in communal groups, really. They interact with each other, but they don't stick together all the time. Additionally, when we're looking at populations, we also like to look at their survivorship numbers. And this is part of an organism's reproductive strategy. How many offspring do they produce initially, and how well do they survive over time? So it describes, like I mentioned, the reproductive strategy of that species. And we can develop a survivorship curve, which is a generalized diagram showing the number of surviving members over time from a measured set of births. And so you'll usually look at an organism in age brackets. Depending on the organism, you'll look at different time spans. And you'll keep track of the number of deaths they have for each bracket and the remaining survivors. So that tells us the percent of the offspring that are still surviving. And there are 3 major types of curves. Now, they'll vary from each other. This is a generalized format, but it does tell us some important information. So in terms of survivorship, there are type 1, type 2, and type 3 survivorship curves. And it gives us information about the life history of a species. So for example, humans are type 1 survivorship curve. When they have offspring, the percentage stays pretty high until later on in life. That's because there's a lot of parental care given by the parents of the offspring. They take care of those organisms for a longer time period, and thus there's higher survivorship as a result of that. So again, that's something like humans, for example. At the opposite end of the spectrum, type 3, this is where you have a drastic drop of the offspring early on, and then it kind of levels out. A good example of this are something like fish, where they spawn in mass numbers, but that's partly because there's very little parental care, and so a lot of the offspring will be consumed by predators early on, and so only a small percentage will survive, and as they get larger, they have a better chance of survival. Well, that's it for today, guys. We'll have another lecture video later this week, so stay tuned.